quite a full agenda for CBAC this morning. We are lucky to have with us this morning Captain Allen from the Winston-Salem Police Department. We'll let her introduce herself here in just a second and get started. But when Lee and Dudley came earlier this year to talk to you as an introduction to this year's work plan, there was a lot of excitement around police and law enforcement consolidation. And so Katie can tell us what is currently happening, both what's in the interlocal agreement and how it works together, as well as collaborations that Winston-Salem Police Department has with the Forsyth County Sheriff's Office, touch on some areas and answer some questions where there may be potential for future collaboration. And then after she gets through, I'll turn it over to Janice. Janice has done a little bit of research about the Charlotte-Mecklenburg arrangement, what they have, and some of the Metro 911 consolidated police communication services throughout the state. So just to kind of give you an overarching piece, it may be that Captain Allen talks about all of those and steals our thunder, and that's perfectly fine if she does. And then after that, we will actually go through the early budget forecast as well. CBAC each year is apprised of the budget development process, and we gave the city council an update just last week. So I will do my best to consolidate that hour and 45-minute meeting down into about 15 minutes for you guys here at the end and let you ask questions about the budget development process for fiscal year 24. So without any further ado, I will turn it over to Captain Allen, really let her talk through what she's got ready for you, and then let you ask any questions you have about what she is speaking about. So thank you again, Captain Allen, and feel free to go ahead.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. So my name is Katie Allen, and I am a captain here at the Winston-Salem Police Department. I'm currently assigned to the Professional Standards Division. What you would know from TV is internal affairs. So we are kind of the big scary monster that is portrayed on TV, but we're not as scary in real life. So I've been here at the department for 23 years, and I have worked for the city in some capacity since I was 15 years old. I started as a lifeguard back in the day and then transitioned right into police work. So I'm going to go through some of this stuff, but feel free if you have questions as I'm going over it to just shout one out. I'm happy to answer them. If I don't have an answer, I'll be happy to get one for you and get it to you electronically or however you do that. So I'm just going to start off, and I hope by explaining some of this stuff, I don't want you to feel like I'm talking down to you or anything. Some people don't understand the differences between police and sheriffs. So I'm going to just kind of give you an overview. I didn't know a lot of the differences until I went to rookie school here of what the two agencies do or how they differ. And so I'm just going to kind of explain some of that first. So the police department, obviously, we are working the city limits of Winston-Salem. So we have jurisdiction within the city limits and then 1 mile outside of the city limits. And so that's everywhere where we can operate. Our basic function is to handle the calls and call response within the city limits. So, and that comprises a lot of different things in terms of call response, traffic enforcement. We have our SWAT team, K-9 operations, and then we also have a community resource unit that handles programming within the city at schools, rec centers, community groups, things like that. Forsyth County Sheriff's Office, they handle call response in the county. And so this would be anything outside the city limits. So think Clemens, Louisville, Rural Hall, places like that, Walkertown. And so they handle those areas. They do not handle Kernersville. So Kernersville has their own police department. So Kernersville Police Department handles the response in those areas. The Forsyth County Sheriff's Office does not handle traffic crashes. So when you have traffic crashes in the county, the Highway Patrol handles those, and they call Highway Patrol to do that. The primary responsibilities that are different within the police and the sheriff's office is some of the things that they are statutorily required to handle. One of those being the court system. So they are responsible for all court security. Which is why every time you go into court or you see in court, it's deputies that handle that. They serve as the bailiffs. They serve as prisoner transport and custody things there at the courthouse. So they handle all the security there. They handle the jail. So the jail operates kind of in a unique way. They are responsible for the jail, but the jail has a different level of personnel inside. So sworn deputies, if you are sworn as a deputy, you can work inside the jail. But if you are a detention officer, you can only work inside the jail. So sworn deputy can do both, call response and work in the jail. They don't typically do that here in Forsyth County. Typically the sworn deputies work in a sworn capacity, answering calls and doing those type things. And they hire largely detention officers that work in the jail. So they are responsible for that inside the jail. They are also responsible for animal control. What we knew as animal control is now known as animal services. So, rabid foxes and all that kind of stuff, vicious dogs, they handle all of that. And then the other thing, one of their big functions is that they handle all service of civil papers. So this would include evictions, 50B orders, domestic violence orders, civil summons, so for things like child custody or family law issues, foreclosures, subpoenas, juvenile petitions, no contact orders. They are responsible for serving all of those. So they have a civil process unit that goes out and handles those certifications. Police cannot serve those. So I couldn't go out there as a sworn officer and serve an eviction notice. I'm not allowed to do that. And then they handle the gun permit. So they do the issuance of the gun permits. So if you're going to purchase a weapon or if you're going to get a carry concealed permit, they are responsible for handling those within Forsyth County. They also now handle the SRO program. So this is kind of bounced back and forth between police and the sheriff's office. And so we turned it back over to them a couple of years back. So they handle SRO responsibilities for all the schools in the Winston-Salem Forsyth County school system. The biggest difference in the two agencies is the state of North Carolina, you have to be certified as a law enforcement officer. So there's two sets of standards. I am certified through the North Carolina Criminal Justice Education and Training Standards Commission. And so they have specific requirements, minimum standards to be hired and work as a law enforcement officer. And then the sheriff's department, they're certified through sheriff standards. And so it's basically the same type of standards commission, but their rules and regulations are different. So we're not interchangeable in that way. So if a sheriff's deputy decides that they want to transfer and come work for the police department, there will be certain hoops and things they have to jump through to get a certification through state training and standards. Likewise, if I go to the sheriff's office, I will have to then be certified through sheriff standards. They're similar to some extent, but the in-service training is different. So every year we're required to complete so much in-service training. The sheriff's training may be different than what we're required to do as police officers. And then in terms of call response, obviously the city has a bigger population, a larger population. So our call volume tends to be a lot greater here in the city limits. So just to give you an idea, from January 1st to February 28th of this year, just the crime against person calls, the Winston-Salem Police Department handled 1,272 calls and the Sheriff's Office handled 470. Crimes against property, the city handled, and again, just that January 1st to February 28th, we handled 1,037 and they handled 345. So that kind of gives you a difference of the call volume and why our agency has a larger number of officers, because the call volume is greater within the city limits in terms of that. If you can imagine, Clemens isn't getting a lot of calls for service in Clemens. Counties, again, because they're not suburban areas, there's less of a population. There's just less of a need for a call response out there. Doesn't mean there's not a need for one. It just means there's less of a need. So that's kind of an overview of the differences between the two agencies in terms of what our daily functions are. So before I move on, is there any questions about that before I move on to kind of what our operations are that are consolidated and shared?
So, hey, I do have a question. This actually might be leading into your next part.
Okay.
I've noticed the last couple of weeks in downtown Winston, there have been like sheriff offices around. Is that like, how's that working basically?
So they do have, they have countywide jurisdiction, so they can answer calls within the city. They don't get dispatched to calls in the city. So let's say I'm a sheriff's deputy and I'm riding through downtown and I see a fight in front of a bar. I can certainly stop and address that situation, and I have jurisdiction within the city to do that. They are assisting us because we are short-staffed right now. They're assisting us in just being visible and being out there. So they do have the ability to do that. Yes, sir.
It's been very noticeable. Yeah.
Okay, good. Any other questions? Okay, so let me move into a little bit of what operations that are kind of consolidated and shared. Number one, so I talked already about the jail and the responsibilities of the sheriffs at the jail. However, at the jail, there's a function of the jail that's called arrestee processing. So let's say I get arrested and I come in I get my probable cause handled. I've been charged with a crime. I have to be processed for that crime. And that simply means photographed, fingerprinted, things like that. Typically, and again, I've tried to research when this, and for as far as I know, Winston has always handled this part of it. They have in my 23 years. And as far back as I've asked, I've never known the sheriff's office to handle it. Typically, when you go to a jail, like if you were to go to Mecklenburg County, you go to the jail as a city police officer, you're going to take your arrestee inside the jail, give your probable cause to a magistrate, and you're going to leave. And that's all you're going to do. When we take an arrestee to jail, so I walk somebody into the jail, let's say they've been charged with assaulting someone, I have to give the probable cause, and then I have to stay with them and walk them through the processing portion of it. And so again, I don't know why or where this process started or if it's always been this way, but Winston-Salem Police Department handles the processing. So we have a job titled a prisoner processing technician. And these folks stay at the jail 24 hours a day. And so once I've been charged with the crime, I take them over, and one of our employees handles fingerprinting, photographing, all the biographical stuff that goes into processing an arrestee. Our personnel do this for the entire county. So if the sheriff's office arrests somebody, if High Patrol, campus police, any law enforcement that brings somebody in the jail that's charged with a crime that's going to be put inside the jail, we have personnel, and so we handle that function. And so that's something that is contracted through the county, and to complete that service. From my understanding, and Scott, this may be something you may know a little bit more, but my understanding is they pay us at the back end for that function. So at the end of the year, we provide a number of, this is how many Winston-Salem arrestees were processed, and this is how many the county processed. The county, I believe, takes on the responsibility of all other agencies. So they would take on High Patrol and things like that, and they would just pay a bulk for that processing function. And again, if I'm wrong on that, Scott, that's just what our forensics lady told me. So
Janice has a slide that will show for all the shared law enforcement services at a high level how they're broken down. So We'll talk about that.
Okay, great. So another function that we have consolidated or shared is our forensics. So these are the crime scene technicians that you see on TV that process all the crime scenes. And so we do that for both the city and the county. This changed several years back. Our understanding is the county had sworn crime scene technicians, and they lost a couple employees, and that unit started dwindling down. And so they had a need to have us assist them. And so now it has turned into, we are full-time doing their processing. It kind of works the same as the jail. So I believe there's an MOU in place of what we provide, and the county pays a contract to us to handle that service. We handle everything with them the exact same way that we do our processing. So there's no skimping in services or anything. Our forensics processors will come out and process a murder scene in the county the exact way they process a murder scene in the city. So there's no differences in the service that is provided at all based on who's calling for them. Another thing that is consolidated and shared is our firearms range. So this firearms range, it was created years back. I want to say maybe in about 2009 or 10, maybe. I could be wrong on that. But the purchase was split. And so the county paid a portion of it and we paid a portion of it. There's two different ranges within the firearms range. There's a 50-yard firearms range and a 100-yard range. Typically, the county uses the 50-yard range and we stay on the 100-yard side. But we work really well. So if the sheriff's office needs the 100-yard side to do, let's say, rifle training, we'll just allow them to use that side and we can swap off as needed. Each agency maintains their own armory there at the sheriff's or at the firearms range. And they have their own staff down there that handles the training. So sheriff's has I believe, a sergeant down there that does all their training, and we have a sergeant and a staff down there as well. We each handle our own lead and brass pickup down there. So that's a big expense in terms of cleaning and making sure the air is clean for the folks that work down there. And so that is stuff that gets split between the two agencies. And so that's a shared, and that's worked out really well, I believe. Another shared function that we have is evidence management. And so our evidence management, they process over 200,000 pieces of evidence every year. And this is split as well. But just to give you an idea, so we take the bulk of it. In 2023, the city police department processed about 24,000 pieces of evidence and were stored there. The county processed about 4,000. So we do take the bulk of that space. And again, Forsyth County pays by the piece each year. So we just take a number of pieces of evidence and then they're billed for that. We also take into account the supplies needed. So there's specific evidence tape and boxes and things like that that have to be used. And so they pay for their portion of that as well. So that are the basic things that are currently consolidated and shared within the two agencies. Is there any questions on those at all that I can answer for anybody? All right. So I'll talk a little bit about other possible areas of consolidation. Number one is the 911 Communications Center. So 911 works in a really interesting capacity, and I was fortunate enough to serve as the captain over support services. And so in my years here, I had never really learned that much about the civilian operations within the department, just because it's not something that I was ever a part of. But I did get to supervise the 911 center, our IT division, our records division. So one area that's really, it can be consolidated, but what's interesting is there's two, what they call peace apps in the city or in the county. That's a primary answering point for emergency response. One of those is the city of Winston-Salem, the police department, and the other one is Forsyth County Emergency Management. So the sheriff's department isn't what's considered a peace app. All the 911 calls in the county will go through the emergency management and filter to the sheriff's office. But a combination center, so we handle some responsibilities kind of jointly. So we have a CAD to CAD where we can send calls immediately over to the county if somebody were to call in and we realize it's a county call. There are some tricky areas like in Pofftown and things like that, that they have a Pofftown address, but it's a county location or a city. And so that happens a lot. But a combination center, so if we were to put all the different 911s together, so you're talking city police, sheriff's department, EMS or Forsyth County Fire, City Fire, if you were to put them all together, that would take a significant amount of time to do because there's just some training that has to be done. 911 operators in our center are not trained for EMS response. We did handle fire. Fire just recently moved to the county, so the city fire department is now being dispatched by the county. So what happens now is if you call 911 in the city limits and you are reporting a fire, that 911 call comes into our 911 center here at the police department. We immediately transfer that call to county 911, and they will dispatch the county fire or city fire at that point. So there is some relay there. So the benefit to having everybody together would be that everybody would be in the same room and you wouldn't have to have these transitions of, and again, it's split second transitions, but as we all know, in an emergency, split second can mean life or death. So you lose some of that, those transitions. So that could be a level of benefit, having everybody together in one structure. So we do work well with these other 911 centers, these other call centers. We have good communication and good relationships with all of them, but consolidating them would take some significant time. You'd have to combine different call response systems and find spacing for that. There is some concern if it goes down, what do we do as a backup? And so like a lot of questions like that would have to be answered. Did you have a question?
Two questions, actually.
Sure.
First, say significant time. Are you talking months, years, decades? Like, what is a significant amount of time?
So in talking to, we met a while back with Guilford County, who has a consolidated center. It just depends on, I guess it kind of depends on the commitment of the different agencies to it. And so I think it would take a year or so. Now, Scott, did you look like you had something to say? It's hard to say. It's definitely not a couple months process.
So it's a couple of years, probably.
Probably.
There was a consolidation study done many years ago, and I think the timeline was about 18 months. Once you make that decision to really get from the front end to the back, about a year and a half.
Second question. So you mentioned that the city and county fire are now consolidated in one 911. What was the rationale behind that? Because I think, and would a similar rationale apply to the police consolidation of 911 dispatching?
So typically, fire responds to fire and they respond to medical calls. So for Forsyth County Emergency Management, they handle the medical calls as well. So the thought was, since fire is responding to fire calls and medical calls, that they're not losing that time in transition, as opposed to, they do run some calls with us, but they're typically running calls with us because they're medical calls.
Okay.
Was that in, you might not know the answer to this, but was that in response to at the county level, fire responding to a greater number or higher propensity of medical calls than was previously expected? Or was it just disproportionate and it just seemed logical to roll them all into one?
My understanding, and based on the conversations I was involved in with Chief Mayo with fire, it was just logical that they were running that many calls with medical and fire.
Yeah, so there's really two things there. 75% of the calls that the fire department runs to are medical calls. So it is the vast majority of their response profile. And the second piece is where Captain Allen talked about, it came into the city and then it went to EMS. If it was a medical call, it came to the city, got transferred to EMS, and then transferred back to the city to dispatch it again. So the logical piece was getting rid of the additional redundancy of sending it back to city dispatch again. Yeah,
makes sense.
So, so that does mean though, so like when calls have both police and EMS, they're getting sent from two different dispatches then, right?
Correct. So a lot of times, so let's say we run calls with EMS a lot. So let's say they have, and typically some of the calls we run with EMS are going to be like a mental subject that's like combative or violent. And so the call typically goes to EMS, and then EMS calls our 911 center and has us respond with them. And they don't typically go into those calls before we get there. So we go in first. If it's some sort of, if there's a threat of violence or danger to them, we will vet that call before will call them in. And so that traditionally works out very, very well. I mean, obviously it would be easier if we were all in the same room, but that system has worked out fairly well. All right, so I think the easiest area of, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, excuse me. I just had a question about that. As a trained 911 dispatcher, I did that for like 12 and a half years. Mm-hmm. So when the police arrive and you have EMS also, are they able to communicate via radio?
No. So let's say I arrive on the scene. I'm just going to say on our radio, it's clear for EMS. And then our dispatcher will contact EMS and say it's clear to come in.
Yeah, that's how we used to do it too. I was just curious because I was trying to figure out if everything gets consolidated, if the two agencies come together. I know that really is still not going to affect that part of EMS because they're still not, you're talking about sheriff and police. They're not going to have radio communication with EMS though. So that would still kind of have to go that way.
The only thought the thought that would speed it up is if they're all in the same room together,
right? That's true.
Dispatcher can just lean right over and say, send them in, as opposed to making a phone call.
I got you.
So it speeds it up by just a few seconds, but
yeah,
you're right. You're very correct on that.
Thank you.
So the easiest area I think for our combination would be on call response. And so obviously a kind of a call is a call. So if you go to a disturbance in the county, it's a disturbance in the city, like they're essentially about the same thing. The only difference would be in terms of what policy and procedure are at each agency in terms of response, and then also how we're trained. So in the city, we're trained, we do our own academy, and we're very well known for our training here at the police department. Not to shirk anything about the sheriff's department's training at all, but we are trained to how we want people to respond to calls in the city. To be a sheriff's deputy, you can go through basic law enforcement training at any community college. And those are typically good programs, but you're not trained specifically to the agency you're going to. You can go to BLET and work at, a college, you can work at a sheriff's deputy, you can work for a city. And so we specifically train our folks to how we expect our employees to perform. So there'd be a little bit of a hump there, and then a little bit of a hump to, it is unique in, use of force continuums, like we are allowed to use force in certain manners. That is guided by law, by general statute, but it's also guided by policy. So if their policy doesn't match our policy, they may be allowed to use force a certain way where we aren't. And so that can kind of create some hiccups. So those are just things that would have to be looked at or discussed. But typically call response is call response. I've been on calls with sheriff's deputies before, and I think almost every officer in this agency has at some point. And so the response is typically the response. But again, that's just kind of the one hiccup you'd have is kind of straightening that stuff out, how that works. Questions on that at all? Okay.
I'll jump in. I think the nuance too is the difference between just collaborating on response versus what we may talk about here in a little bit with Charlotte-Mecklenburg, which is a consolidated response unit that responds both within the city limits and to specific parts of the county as well. So there's a vast difference between responding together versus the one agency being the primary response for multiple jurisdictions kind of thing.
And right now we do have an excellent partnership with the sheriff's office. So I know specifically our gang unit is working really, really closely with their JIT team. It's JIIT. I think it's juvenile intervention. I don't know what the other I, but it's essentially the same thing. Those teams are really working well in a collaborative fashion because, this gun violence and gang violence is such a problem right now in the city limits and both the county. And so they do a lot of operations together. Additionally, we have our drug task force that is made up of both city and county officials. So we have, and it has Kernersville as part of it too. And they do vice and narcotic operations throughout the whole county. So there are county folks and city folks and Kernersville officers working together to do these joint drug investigations right now. And that's been working out pretty well.
I have two quick questions just so I get an idea of scope here. So the county has much less population than the city. How do the 911 operations compare? Is the city much bigger? Are they comparable? Like, do you have any idea?
I don't have numbers in front of me, but I do know that our call center is extremely busy, like to the point where we have sworn officers answering the phone in there as an off-duty assignment to assist with the call vetting. That we've allowed that as an off-duty opportunity because there's so many calls coming in.
And that's not true in the county that you know of?
Not that I know of, no.
And second question, so do we just have three police forces, county, city, and Kernersville?
In our jurisdiction, well, and then you have campus police, so you would have all
yeah, I know, sorry, yeah.
Correct.
Yeah. So how does Kernersville get dispatched? Do they have their own 911?
I don't, honestly, I know they have a communication center. I don't know the answer to that question. I can certainly find that out. I honestly don't know the answer to that. I don't remember if they're a PSAP or not.
They do have their own PSAP, Katie.
Okay. I was thinking they did, but I couldn't 100% remember. I didn't want to tell you wrong.
So there's 3 911 centers then in the county. One for the county, one for the city, and one for Kernersville. Yeah.
Yes.
And I know the campus police just get dispatched by calling campus police. I know that.
Correct.
At Wake Forest, yeah.
And if you're getting a 911 call, if you're calling 911 from Wake Forest, it's coming to us.
Yeah.
Any other questions? So this was actually the most interesting thing to me kind of in preparation for this, in looking at like what Charlotte-Mecklenburg does. And I just was unaware. And so I reached out to a friend of mine. He's the captain of their internal affairs there in Charlotte-Mech. And so he kind of gave me some insight into how they work. And I never knew this. So their combination, they had Mecklenburg County Police Department and they had Charlotte Police Department, and those two agencies combined back in the 90s. I think it was like the early 90s, maybe 93. They started working on the combination. So you essentially combined two police departments as opposed to like a sheriff's office and a city police department. And so the Mecklenburg County Police Department was handling calls in Mecklenburg County. And obviously Charlotte Police Department at that time was handling calls in the Charlotte city limits. So they combined. And so Charlotte Mech now they have countywide jurisdiction. Now they do have a lot of small departments. And you just being from North Carolina, you're probably familiar, Mint Hill and Pineville and Matthews, all these different agencies. And so they typically, it's kind of works like Kernersville. Those agencies handle their own city limits. But the Charlotte Mecklenburg Police Department can come into their jurisdiction anytime and do any sort of operation or look for a wanted person or anything. And they don't have to have mutual aid or anything like that to do that. But the 911 calls are being handled, and the call response are being handled by the Mint Hill Police Department, the Matthews Police Department, or whatever. So they have those countywide jurisdiction. Likewise here, Mecklenburg County Sheriff's Office handles court, jail, civil paper. They only have, from what he told me, he thought was about 68 sworn officers, sworn deputies in the Mecklenburg County Sheriff's Office, which seemed really small to me for that large of a county. But it kind of shows you that Charlotte Mecklenburg Police Department is handling the bulk of what's going on in that area. He did say that they had, Charlotte Mech has their own dispatch center, and then fire and medical has their own dispatch center. So they operate independently. Again, I would just imagine the call response kind of necessitates that. They probably they run a lot of calls. And currently Charlotte Mecklenburg Police Department has 1,650 sworn officers. So they're allocated about 2,000. I think 2,200 or so, he said. So they're pretty short right now too. So it's really not a combination, and I just didn't know this, of a kind of a sheriff and police. It's two police departments that join together. So you'd still have some of those hiccups in terms of the differences in a sheriff and a police department when you're looking at that. So any questions on that? I don't know that I may be able to answer them, but.
I have a question.
Okay.
Ross, what are the vacancies in Charlotte compared to the Salem Police Department?
So we are currently short about 140 officers, which is pretty significant. And it sounds like they're short, several hundred as well. So I think everybody's kind of running piecemeal at this point. Greensboro, I believe I heard the other day, was short about 140. And so we're all kind of in really desperate, trying times in terms of staffing right now. So I would say they're all pretty comparable. They're missing large chunks of what they're allocated.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And so I had two questions. One, so if I understand this right, there is a Charlotte Sheriff's Office as well as now, do they just handle court stuff?
Court, jail, civil paper service.
Okay. So now they don't actually respond to calls then.
Correct. I mean, they can, he said, but typically CMPD has responded to those calls.
68 versus 1,600, I would imagine.
Correct.
Yeah, they just don't have the time for that. Second question, do you have from talking with your friend, do you have a rough idea how many years that took to combine the two police departments?
I don't know. So he wasn't there when he said he came on not long after it happened, and there's very few people still with the agency that were like that. So I don't know. I'd have to do some real research into it. I'm just not sure.
It was 30 years ago. So I mean, yeah.
Fred, in Mecklenburg, the sheriff's department actually also, it's kind of the inverse of how it is here, handles all of the processing at all.
Correct. Yes, ma'am.
My question is from a budgetary perspective. Would a combined call center, because when I look at these jobs that are posted, sometimes I still get those alerts from however long ago. And it looks like the pay or the salary for those jobs is kind of low for those call center. Would a combined call center mean more jobs created, or mean that maybe you don't need to fill some of those vacancies because you'll have more people from both places coming together? And so maybe then is there any discussion about salary for if this is consolidated for those kind of jobs?
Scott, I'll let you hit that first. Looks like you want to say something, then I'll speak.
So there's a couple of things there to probably disentangle. One is the salary component of that and whether someone is being paid a correct market salary. So on the city side, at least, we are going to be initiating a compensation and classification study next fiscal year to look at every position across the organization. Forsyth County actually just recently did this and effected some changes in January. So some of their public safety communicators may have actually gotten some small pay raises, or large, I don't know by that position class, in January, but it's something that we're looking at. In terms of how many positions you need and that kind of thing. I alluded to a study that was done many years ago.
Mhm.
And so I wasn't here when that study was done. And Katie, you can correct me if you know anything about this or have heard, but from the management discussions, the consultant that was hired to do it suggested merging the two operations and increasing staffing by something like 20%. And it was not palatable at the time to either the city or the county to consolidate an operation and add a whole bunch of people. And so that was part of why I think the consolidation fell apart at that point. We'd have to look at it again, but I don't know that you would lose any positions. I think with the vacancy levels that you have, the number of authorized positions for the people in the chair would probably have to stay the same, but it's something that we would really have to study and look at. And I don't think that level of study has been done in quite some time. So we'd have to look at how many positions we needed, if there are efficiencies, particularly in the hierarchy of management. Do you need, you know, 2 directors and 2 whatever? So there may be some of that scale that you look at. But in terms of a call volume, you know, Katie told you, I mean, we're doing everything we can to answer the calls that we have. And some of that's related to vacancy, and we're running massive amounts of overtime. And that is a position, you know, Jamesina, you can get burnt out pretty quickly, add a whole bunch of overtime to it. And it's a very difficult position to have. So from a budget perspective, it's one we would really have to take a look at how many positions you actually needed for the number of calls that you were doing over time for all of those consolidated operations. It's not an easy one to answer right now,
Yeah.
but I will tell you in the past, the answer was not consolidate and add 20% staffing. So,
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and all I was going to just say to that is staffing we're at terribly low levels there as well. So we're having a hard time. I imagine that consolidation, we would probably lose some people because they're not going to want to learn the medical part and those requirements. We specifically, I know when I was over there, we specifically asked staff if anyone would be interested in just dispatching fire so that they would have just a really wealth of knowledge, and none of them were interested. They all wanted to do police and fire. And so it's just not they kind of like what they like, unfortunately. And so I do feel like we'd lose employees, honestly. Making a 20-some year person have to go get medical training to answer those calls. We'd probably have some people go. So it'd just be hard. It'd be challenging. So that's kind of all I had in terms of, and I hope that gives you some information in terms of what the differences are and what we do together. Like I said, we have an excellent partnership with the sheriff's office currently. It's the best it's been since I've been at the agency, since Sheriff Kimbrough took over. I think that a lot of our higher level executive staff have had good experiences with him. They know him from years and years and years ago. So it's been a really collaborative and good partnership. And so we do work very well together, I do believe. That's all I got, Scott.
All right. Well, Captain Allen, you're more than welcome to hang out just here for a few minutes. I'm going to share my screen and let Janice go through some slides, and she may go through them kind of quickly. I think Katie has hit on quite a few things that we were going to talk about. One of the maps is actually going to be really good for what she was talking about in terms of SHARMEC response, but I will share that and let Janice walk through it. And then after that, Katie, you can let us go. So let me get that screen shared. And I hope everybody is seeing the presentation. Good. And then did everybody see it change slides there? Okay. All right, go ahead, Janice.
So yeah, a lot of what I'm going to talk about in this presentation has already been covered by Katie, but I'm thankful for that because she is the subject matter expert. And this is just research that I've been able to conduct over the last couple of weeks. So we can go ahead and go to the next slide. So I did want to touch on just again, the shared services between the city of Winston-Salem and Forsyth County that is managed by the interlocal agreement. And in that separation of responsibilities that's in the contract, you'll see law enforcement, both in the city of Winston-Salem for the police department, as well as Forsyth County for the sheriff's office. So you can go to the next slide. And as Katie talked about, there is listed in that contract, specifically arrestee processing, forensics, evidence storage, and the firing range. For arrestee processing, and I'm not going to go through what those are again because she explained them very, very well. But for the cost division for arrestee processing, forensics, and evidence storage, all of those are divided pretty similarly. It's based on the percentage of arrests or workload volume or inventory items collected. And at the end of the year, based on that percentage that's allocated between the city and the county, those costs are divided, and the county pays the city for the cost for that service for them. And then for the firing range, what's in the contract. So I know what happens in practice is a little bit different because the sheriff's office does provide their own armory, does provide their own cleaning, and does have staff located at the building. But as far as in the contract, operating cost for the building, so that would be like water, electric, those are going to be covered by the city. And that's part of an agreement with fire as well, because there is a fire training facility in the county that city fire can use. And the county pays the operating cost of that building, electric, water for that building. But the city and county pay for their own supplies, cleaning, training staff for each of those facilities that both city and county can use. And we can go to the next slide, Scott. So one thing I wanted to touch on, so there are agreements not just between the city of Winston-Salem and the sheriff's office, but also between the different communities in Forsyth County and the sheriff's office to provide community policing. So Kernersville does provide their own police department, but Clemens, Louisville, Rural Hall, Walkertown, Bethania, and Tobaccoville, and I'll get to Bethania and Tobaccoville in a little bit, they do not provide their own police department. So the primary law enforcement agency that's going to be doing call response in those jurisdictions is going to be the sheriff's office. And how these contracts work is each of these communities contract to have a certain number of deputies patrol in those communities within those jurisdictions and respond to calls within those jurisdictions, but they are sheriff's deputies. You can go to the next slide. So the idea with these contracts is to prevent the administrative overhead that would be required in having your own police department. Because as Katie mentioned, you can imagine there is not a ton of call response needed in each of those communities. The call response within those 4 communities is a very small percentage of the already small percentage of call response within the county that sheriff's deputies respond to. So, and I will say the sheriff's deputies that are assigned in those 4 communities, they can respond to calls. They do have countywide jurisdiction. So if there is a call on the outside of Clemens that is not in town limits, they are able to respond to that if the sheriff's office needs them to. The contract simply dictates that their patrol and primary call response is going to be within that community. So that way that community can have a visible and continuous police presence throughout the day. So, and I will say this isn't a situation where the sheriff's office dictates the number of deputies assigned. Actually, the communities dictate themselves how many deputies they want and the shifts and like the times that they want them there. For example, Walkertown has 1 deputy. They just want 1 deputy there during daylight hours. It goes back to regular call response in the evening, but during daylight hours, they like to have 1 deputy just kind of doing continuous patrol for day shift. And the community dictates how they want that individual schedule who's contracted to stay there to work. As far as payment, the municipalities have 2 options that they can choose between each year when they renew their contract. It's either a fixed rate. So the fixed rate means that the sheriff's office will estimate the cost, and this is based on projected salaries for the positions that they're contracting with and actual operating costs, administrative costs from the previous year. And they will assign that cost at the beginning of the year, and the communities will pay a fixed quarterly amount. And this prevents, there's pros and cons to that because the other option is a reconciled rate. So that means that you'll pay a fixed estimated cost for the first 3 quarters. And then at the 4th quarter, based on the actual cost of the year, that 4th quarter rate can fluctuate. So you either pay more or less than the estimated cost. The pro is that if you don't spend everything from that estimated cost, you're going to pay a slightly less fee at the end of the year. The con is that, for example, the past couple of years, there's been inflation, both with supplies, but particularly fuel. Costs can go way up, and then you're paying a much larger fee than you thought as a community. So if you were to ask a lot of the communities right now, a lot of them are on fixed rate contracts because of that unpredictable economy. But maybe in the future, they'll decide to go back to a reconciled rate, but they have the choice to determine that every year. And you can go to the next slide. Those contracts are to determine the prices are kind of divided into 3 buckets. So direct cost is the direct cost for that individual who's going to be in the town. So that's their salary, their benefits, their uniforms, any sort of travel and training that they need to do as a sheriff's deputy, the vehicle, any other sort of capital that they need. Indirect cost is just vehicle fleet cost for that vehicle. So the cost to maintain the vehicle and depreciation, and then the administrative fee. So this is a calculation that the sheriff's office does based on the percentage of assigned deputies, and it's a percentage of the total operation of administrative costs. So that's like sheriff's office has their own IT department, they have their own HR department. And so they kind of divide out an administrative fee to those communities based off of those services. And we can go to the next slide. So in those contracts, there is a list of assigned responsibilities. So it lists patrol, answering calls for service, conducting general security for the communication for the towns, providing information to the public, interacting with residents, and then performing other duties as assigned, which kind of, allows the towns to have some flexibility with what they'll ask those deputies to do, what like coming to town events and providing security. So that's just kind of that general bucket that those communities can interact with those deputies with. And we can go to the next slide. So this is Bethany and Tobacconville are I just said exceptions to the rule. So the other jurisdictions that don't have police departments, they do contract for deputies to be providing service in town limits, but Bethany and Tobacconville, they do not have police departments, but they also don't contract for community deputies. They simply just have the same level of service and priority as the unincorporated patrol area. So the deputies that patrol Bethany and Tobacconville also patrol a larger unincorporated ETJ area around Bethany and Tobacconville. They're not just assigned to those communities like the other community deputies are. And I will stop there and just ask if there are any questions about how those contracts work.
Hey, Janice, I have two questions. One, can you go back to the slide where you had the numbers of people per community? Cool. I just wanted to know what those were. Second, do you know how many deputies there are in the sheriff's department? What's the total number?
I do not off the top of my head. I used to be able to tell you that back
know?
when I was there. But I'm sure it's changed. But that is something. Let me see if I can text somebody and see if I can get you a response before the end of this meeting.
Okay.
Fred, that's one that we could probably find.
And we could get that for you fairly quickly if we need to.
I was just wondering how big it is compared to the Winston-Salem Police Department. Really, is it about the same size, a quarter of, 1/10 of, just to get a vague sense.
Mm-hmm. We'll see if I get an answer there. Yeah, that's something that I can get to you fairly quickly, but I do not have that number off the top of my head, unfortunately. And if there's not any more questions, we can switch to Mecklenburg County. So I'm going to touch on a lot of the areas that Katie kind of talked about with their consolidated policing services. So we can go to the next slide. So with the contract between Charlotte and Mecklenburg, so their initial contract was enacted in 1996. They managed under that agreement until 2018, and now there is a 5-year renewal built into that contract, so they'll be renewing their current contract pretty soon. The way that responsibilities are divided between Charlotte and Mecklenburg County, as Katie said, Mecklenburg still has to provide civil processing, building security for the court system, as well as the detention center and arrestee processing. They manage that as well. But as for call response, the city of Charlotte is considered the lead law enforcement agency, which means that whenever there is a call dispatched, it's going to be Charlotte Mecklenburg Police Department that's responding to those calls within Mecklenburg County. And the contract specifically divides out the ETJ areas, not just of the city, but of the town of Davidson, town of Mint Hill, and the portion of Huntersville where the nuclear power plant is located. And the ETJ, just to explain what it is, she mentioned how police departments have jurisdiction a mile outside of town limits. The ETJ is that mile outside of town limits. So rather than the police department also having jurisdiction in that mile radius, it's actually Charlotte Mecklenburg that's going to be responding in those areas for those towns who have elected to have Charlotte Mecklenburg respond in those areas. So this is a map of Charlotte Mecklenburg police response or call response. And you can see where Mint Hill, Matthews, Pineville, Huntersville, Cornelius, and Davidson, they're whited out because those are the city limits, and that is where they have their own police departments that are dispatched, and they handle their own call response. Charlotte-Mecklenburg can respond to those areas, but typically they're dispatched just in the areas in gray on that map. So we can
Ms.
go ahead.
Janice, I
Yes.
just wanted to say, I just did some research real fast. It says there's about 300 sheriff's deputies in the Forsyth County Sheriff's Office,
Thank
and
you.
about 539 or 540 sworn police at WSPD. But I'm sure that Chief Allen probably could answer that part, about 540 for Winston-Salem PD.
Yeah, that's probably our allocation. I think we're down in the 4s right now. And then I would just say, keep in mind with the sheriff's office, I believe they added a lot of positions when they took back the SRO program. And then with the creation of the JIT team that they just created. So I do know they added some positions. And then we're vacant, but yes, our allocation is in the 540s for sure. We'd love to have it. So, and yeah, I want to be police officers.
Yeah, I know that a much smaller portion of their total allocation, I mean, probably not much smaller. I want to say it's probably like in the 65% is actually allocated towards patrol, or maybe like 55, but the rest of it has to do with civil processing. They do have some people assigned to the detention center that are sworn, not many, but just a couple. They do handle court security at the courthouse. And then, yeah, they have a lot of different units for like the JIT team, and just they have a lot of different stuff. So I have asked about their patrol number, and I'm just kind of waiting to see. If I don't get a response today, I'll do a follow-up on what that looks like, the comparison there. But we can go to the next slide. So this is just an addendum of their agreement that I thought was interesting. So they have a separate addendum to their overall policing contract just for Lake Patrol, and that includes agreements with the town. So the first is with Lake Norman. So this is between Charlotte-Mecklenburg Police Department, Huntersville, and then Cornelius as well. So Cornelius provides the primary police response or call response on Lake Norman. CMPD is a backup. CMPD, though, provides the primary response on the portion of Lake Norman that, again, is around the McGuire Nuclear Power Station. So they are patrolling not just on land for that power station, but also on lake. So tight security there. For Mountain Island Lake and Lake Wiley, CMPD is going to be the primary law enforcement response for those two lakes, with them having a boat patrol or boating safety role, where they actually have a patrol unit out there on a boat during peak summer hours, and they to the point where they have like the number of hours per day that they're going to be patrolling during certain months of the year. And that's all laid out very clearly in their contract. And it's what you would think. It's like April to September, like 6 days a week, daylight hours, when those lakes are going to have peak business. And so we can go to the next slide. And so how the costs are divided, I will say it was very complicated to understand, because it's based off of in a property like a tax, a district tax that is not actually levied. So this is the best way that I could think of to summarize it. So the costs are divided by the city and the county. So the county pays the city based on the estimated value of a law enforcement district tax in the ETJs and unincorporated areas that is not levied, but it's just, if they levied it, this is what that would be valued based on property tax values. Regardless of what that value comes to, the county must pay the city a minimum of $14 million per year. And then in future reevaluation years, that amount can be adjusted based on the changes of property tax value. And so then just moving into 911 services, I will stop there though. Are there any further questions about police services in Mecklenburg County or in Forsyth County before we talk about 911? No. Okay. So These are the 3 different 911 communication centers in Forsyth County. So first is Forsyth County 911 Communications. That includes EMS and fire as the primary. The sheriff's office does have a separate operation, but those calls are filtered through emergency management communications, and then the sheriff's office has a separate group that will take over the dispatching of those calls if it's determined to be a sheriff's office call. Kernersville Police Department handles their own 911 communications dispatch, and Winston-Salem Police Department handles their own 911 communications dispatch. This is just so far, this is the consolidation efforts, and Katie kind of talked about this. So fire used to be dispatched by the city police department, or city fire used to be dispatched by the city police department. In the last year, city fire dispatched has moved to the county, and they have absorbed those calls as well as the costs. So when that consolidation happened, county emergency management added 8 telecommunicators to handle the increased call volume for city fire calls. And so that is the initial fee that the city is going to pay the county. It's it was estimated to be $404,000 or $405,000 if you round up, to add those 8 individuals. That is not going to be a continuous cost for the city. That cost is going to go down in increments over the next 5 years. And at that point, the county will fully absorb the cost of those 8 additional staff person to handle city fire dispatch, and they'll fully absorb the calls as well. And then to the next slide. So future collaborations, Katie kind of touched on this as well, but there is currently an agreement underway to relocate the city police department dispatch to the sheriff's office building. However, they're not going to be combined, even though they're going to be located in the same building. They're going to remain separate operations, and this does have to do with the differences in training. So while they will still remain separate operations, they'll be located in the same building, and the city will pay the county a fee to relocate their 911 center to the sheriff's office.
I will also say a part of that consolidation is necessitated by the building structure itself. Our current 911 operations are in an older building, and it's not going to meet the hardening structures required by state statute, and the county building does. So part of that move is to get them into a secured structure where, heaven forbid, there were some type of natural disaster. The building that they'll be moving into has a higher hardening level and would hopefully not take as much damage, and would be able to operate in the event of some cataclysmic earthquake in the triad or tornado or something to that effect. So.
Yeah. And I will say, since they will be located in the same building, I mean, I do think the natural question is, could they consolidate in the future? I do think that hanging question still is just the time that it would take, the differences in training, and how that would impact both departments for, to handle that consolidation. So we can go to the next slide. I did want to mention that combined Metro 911, that is something that a lot of jurisdictions have moved to have consolidated 911 systems with one primary PSAP serving all the municipalities and jurisdictions countywide. 73 actually of the 100 counties in North Carolina have moved to this model, to having one primary PSAP, and within those counties, expenses are commonly divided just by the percentage or number of calls within each jurisdiction's territory for dispatch. And then, since we touched on Mecklenburg County, I thought I would just touch on how their 911 is handled. So they do have Charlotte-Mecklenburg consolidated, so they have 3 separate operations for their police, fire, and EMS, but it all kind of falls under the Charlotte-Mecklenburg 911 communications budget. But they have 3 separate operations to handle fire calls, medical calls, police calls, just based on call volume. And then Cornelius Police Department and Pineville Police Department have their own 911 dispatch to handle calls within each of their respective city limits. And that is everything that I have. So if there are any further questions on that, I am happy to try to answer them or follow up with you guys at a later date.
Janice, on that last slide, for Cornelius and Pineville, Do they, if it is a fire EMS call, do they kind of follow the quick transfer model to Charlotte Mecklenburg level, or do they have their own fire and EMS response teams?
So from what I understand, and I am not sure about that 100%, but I do know for Cornelius and Pineville, it is specifically listed as police dispatch. So based on that, I would assume that they do have that quick transfer model for fire and medical to the Charlotte Mecklenburg. I think there are no more questions, so I'll turn it back to you, Scott.
Looks like
I have a
James.
quick one.
Uh-huh.
And this may be more for Captain Allen. I'm not sure. Are they looking at improved response times as being one of the benefits of possibly consolidating the two departments into one, the county and the city? Our current response times are, especially in those areas that you said, like Town, that are kind of gray, you know, it's kind of like sort of a county and it's sort of not. And is the thought that after a consolidation, that maybe response times for officers to get to calls, especially with a combined call center and a combined department, are we looking at that as like is that one of the talking points or arguing points?
Honestly, I don't know the answer for 100% certainty. I would think that, and I don't know have our call response times right now in front of me. I would think what's affecting our call response times right now more than anything is our staffing.
Yeah, not having enough officers.
That's really, it's not a matter of us not getting the calls. It's a matter of us not having people to go to them.
Exactly.
That's hurting us the most.
So, but like in a consolidation effort, there would be, I don't want to say more officers covering some of those outlying areas, but there kind of would be. Whereas right now, the sheriff's office kind of does those what I would call outskirt type areas. So if we combine, does that kind of mean you've got more officers per square mile responding, or not necessarily?
It wouldn't change our response. What it would affect is, so if you're familiar, last week we had officer involved shooting that involved both police, fire, and police, sheriffs, and highway patrol, having a consolidated call center. So they initiated that pursuit in the county, and having that information, we are having to get it from their call center who's having it, and we'd have more quick response in terms of that information sharing, I think is what would speed up the process. And that would be hugely beneficial. Now we have a lot of supervisors that have scanners in their cars, but having that, you know, right there.
Communication. Yeah, that's true. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
So I will say one of the interesting things probably in terms of any type of consolidated response in Forsyth County is when you think about Charlotte and Mecklenburg, the unincorporated areas of Mecklenburg County are significantly more dense in terms of population than some of the unincorporated area of Forsyth County. So response standards are probably different in unincorporated Mecklenburg than they would be in unincorporated Forsyth. So when you think about that overlap of how many people are on a beat kind of thing, you may have to think about different levels or standards of service in terms of how many folks are out there based on call volumes. That would be something that would be a completely different exercise for the analysis here versus Charlotte. There's probably a lower number of calls in the unincorporated area, but I would imagine there's a greater difference between the city and the unincorporated county here than in Charbec. So other questions, comments, concerns generally in this area, we can do a little bit of research here. And as more questions, you know, if you think of something later in the week, feel free to email us. We can shoot them over.
So I do have a question, Scott. This is sort of more about this general issue of consolidation of police services. It sounds to me what Charlotte and Mecklenburg did is they kind of kept the sheriff's office for court and judicial work and merged all the other police services. Is that what county and cities do in North Carolina mostly, or are they actually merged all of their duties together, including the judicial and court services?
So the judicial and court services thing, the counties are statutorily required to do that. So, I mean, you would have to have some additional legislative authority for somebody to take that over. And I'm not really sure that
Okay, so
anybody
that has to be separate in some sense. Okay.
without special legislation, it would have to be separate. Yeah. And I think, I don't know of anybody else who's doing a combined, Katie told you it was Mecklenburg Police. So at some point way back before Mecklenburg Police, there was just Mecklenburg County doing unincorporated response, but they got so dense that they actually formed their own police response unit for that area and then merged with the city.
Well,
That's just
if
a
there-
function of how big and dense they are.
I guess if there was consolidation in Forsyth County and the city, it would be more taking the police response from the county, but keeping the judicial services with the county, right?
So if that were to take place and those conversations were to happen, and I'd like to say, I don't know of anybody who's currently engaging in those conversations. This is kind of that on the periphery thing that we're talking about, but more than likely, I think what you would see is a default for the Winston-Salem Police Department to potentially oversee that and expand outward. But that's not to say that that's the only model under which something like that could happen. Anybody, any series of politicians anywhere could come up with any number of ideas on how to consolidate something of that nature. But I think that would be what you would probably look at. Now, there are a lot of other places. We could do a little more research for you. There are other cities and counties in other states that work differently, but they have different state law statutes and setups as well. So if you wanted us to, we could poke around and show you kind of what some of the independent cities in Virginia do when they do the same kind of thing, or some of our other neighbors, just to kind of get a very high level of what happens in other states. But Katie, I don't know of anybody else that's got a city county combined response of any kind in North Carolina.
Not that I know of at all.
So it would be relatively cutting edge.
Yeah, Scott, I mean, this just sticking a pin in this so that we can roll it into future conversations when we're talking about recommendations maybe later in the year, but it'd be interesting to have a conversation about how this kind of affects both the critical response team at the county level and the BEAR program at the city level. When we're talking about kind of improved response more generally. But I think that'd be, as we're talking about how we might think that could be rolled into the budget, make your recommendations, an interesting way to present that out to the public as far as the improved police response writ large for a consolidated program would work.
We could definitely go back and think about the BEAR team and the unit that EMS has on the county side with response as well. If there's nothing else, we will let Captain Allen get along to her law enforcement and other administrative duties.
Thank you for having me. I put my email and phone number in the chat box, so please feel free to reach out if you have questions. Thank you guys for having me.
Thank you very much, Captain Allen.
Thanks, Katie. So we are going to move on here, and I'm going to try and quickly go through kind of the early budget forecast that was presented to the city. I will say, if you're a budget nerd of sorts, we did a presentation last or 2 Mondays ago, I think, to city council, and it was about an hour and 20 minutes long, and it included budget related issues, which I'm going to show you. But then we talked a lot about capital project capacity, key work items, our strategic plan, and really how our 20% vacancy rate in the city is affecting our ability to get things done. So I'm going to talk just on the budget side, budget planning, and then spend maybe 30 seconds talking about the other 60 slides that were there. But if you want to go see them, that link is out on the city's YouTube page. So let me try and share this PDF real quick, and we'll walk through this. Again, I'm going to kind of go through it pretty quickly. Stop me if you have any questions, but just generally, I'm going to run through what was shown to city council, let you know where we are budget development wise at this point. So I talked about vacancy. Pre-pandemic, overall city vacancy was about 10%. We're now at 20%. I will tell you, since December 31st, when I took this, we're 3/4 of a percentage point higher. So we are at more than double the vacancy. As you can imagine, that is hampering. Katie told you they're short 140 sworn law enforcement officers. They're short somewhere in the neighborhood of 60 to 80 non-sworn positions as well. Looking at it, again, this is a point in time, so this ebbs and flows by department and department size. But in late December, early January, almost half of our fleet department was vacant. Our community development department had 1/3 of their folks vacant.
What's fleet?
What fleet services? That's the folks who fix cars and trucks and heavy equipment, mechanics. Yeah. Stormwater, you can see kind of our transportation area there. Those are all about a third police. Again, 28%, that's sworn and non-sworn, and it just goes down from there. So take out all the departments that are 20% plus, and then all of the other departments still have an average vacancy rate higher than pre-pandemic, right? So that it's just very difficult for us to get done our daily operations, much less all the projects that are in the hopper. So just some context. Talked a lot about financial incentives. The city council has actually done a lot policy-wise in the last year in terms of adding benefits, both cash benefits in terms of sign-on and retention incentives, as well as in-service vacation pay. We've done a lot on the benefit side to try and help with recruitment and retention. Just doesn't seem to be stemming the tide at this point. Again, a whole nother page of that stuff. Okay, well, what are we missing there? We're missing a slide. Not really sure what that was. I'll go back and check, make sure we're not missing anything there. So this is where we hit early budget forecast, kind of talking the numbers for 24. Year end for the current year, our early estimate is that we'll add about $3 million to fund balance in the general fund. We added about $20 million organically last year. The difference there is we decided to fund some things one time. And so we actually thought we were going to use some cash, but because of vacancy and coming in under budget, we're actually going to add to the city coffers, as it were. That's the projection. A note on county sales tax. We've talked about this for a long time. Sales taxes have just been coming along. If you look at this chart, each one of these is the fiscal year and then how much growth you've had from the prior year. So if you look at August here, you're talking about distributions, at least at the countywide level, having risen from the 9 million range almost to 16 million in the course of 3 years. I will note some of this is because of how refunds get distributed to the county and then to the city. So you may see a huge growth month like this, and then in the same year see a negative growth, and that's just kind of refunds balancing itself out. The note to take from this is from 20 to 21 and 21 to 22, we were seeing 10+% growth. It appears, at least in these last couple of months, that things are starting to slow down a little bit. So the sales tax that was coming in 10+% may be starting to taper back down a little bit. It's really early to know whether those 2 months are a trend or not, but we're going to keep an eye on it.
Hey, Scott, is there any way you could add 2019 since that's pre-pandemic? And we don't really know if it's kind of hard to tell if it's just a return to normality or not.
So we could go back. We've got years and years and years of this data. I would tell you,
saying just because we had a sudden change in the world for a couple of years, might be nice to see what was before that.
Yeah, one of the really difficult things about this, Fred, is that they implemented sales tax for a lot of the online retail sales in the middle of this. And so I can't separate out that part of it. We know some of this growth. Every time you buy something on eBay or Amazon, you're getting charged tax now where you didn't. So some of that growth is because of online retail shopping. And I would tell you historically, we were looking at 4% growth on average, probably before the pandemic. That was just our kind of normalized rate. And now we're seeing 10 plus, but I couldn't tell you how much is inflation versus how much is a difference in what's being charged and where. So for year end, a lot of numbers on this page. I'll draw your attention to the bottom left graphic, which is someone with a crystal ball trying to figure out where we're actually going to end. I've told city council multiple times, if I knew what the economy was going to do, I'd probably be working for Exxon and be making billions of dollars. But generally, sales tax growth is better than budget. We've got a couple of construction permits are starting to slow down a little bit, which is a leading indicator for us that the economy may be slowing down a little bit on the real property growth side in terms of people that are making investments to build new buildings and do renovations. So just an early indicator there. This is probably the driver that we're talking the most with council about. Coming in $4 million under budget. We have so many vacancies. That's what's driving, obviously, coming in under budget on salaries. Because we don't have people to fill the positions, we don't have people to manage the contracts, and we don't buy the supplies that we would otherwise buy in a lot of those positions. So we're seeing some pretty significant savings compared to budget on the supplies, services, and contracts area, also because we don't have the people, which is an interesting thing to note. Vehicle acquisition is an interesting one. We've told council most of the vehicles we're buying are 10 to 40% more expensive than what we budgeted, but we can't get them delivered. So in the current fiscal year, we're actually going to see some budget savings on vehicle acquisition because we can't take delivery of things. But when we do get them, they're going to cost us a lot more than what we were originally budgeting for them. I mean, I went out and bought a car personally. Most of when you look at the dealerships, the individual cars are jumping anywhere from 8 to 16% retail price every year at this point. We're seeing the same thing on our vehicle acquisition side, and it's usually worse on the heavy equipment. They jump even higher. So continuing down, there we go. Just a note there for what we talked about. We're going to add to fund balance, even though I showed you a bunch of numbers, said we'll be under budget. Again, it's because of a lot of one-time stuff. This is all the one-time stuff that's kind of in the budget. We had a lot of capital needs that we programmed. We've purchased some land, had some different things hit us in terms of tax collection services. I'm not going to go through all of these, but just showing city council that we're not going to add as much to the savings account because we did have a lot of things that kind of got added off cycle or that were one-time adjustments. So that brings us to, that was 23, where we're at, where we might end the year. What does 24 look like? So when we showed this to city council, we were looking at about a $6 million gap between expenses and revenues in the general fund, which is about 2.25 cents on the tax rate. We always give them a heads up in early budget forecast. Here's the deficit. And if we were to plug it right now, this is about what it would cost you. That's not to say that we're going to raise the tax rate 2 cents. It's also not to say that we're not going to, but just kind of how does that equal out if we had to generate that revenue just off the property tax base?
Scott, I have a question.
Yeah.
Do we budget for insurance on vehicles, particularly police vehicles that would be in accidents?
So no, typically we're self-insured on the vehicle side. We have a risk management reserve fund that pays for a lot of that. We do have property insurance for land and buildings, but on the vehicle side, the answer to that is no.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, it's generally cost prohibitive for us to purchase that compared to the interest that we make on the large amount of money that we have in our risk management reserve to help pay for some of that. So again, looking at 24 at a very high level, we're talking about 6% employee raises. Inflation is still in that kind of 7-ish% range and has been as high as 8.5% in the prior months. We did 4% for employees in the current budget. So looking at really 6% adjustments in next year's budget. We do have some increased retirement costs from the state. So our local government employees retirement system is going up. Our benefits factor is going up about a full percentage point to account for that. We do have some, just wanted to note, recycling is going to be starting as a city provided service on April 1st. And so we budgeted about a half a year this year. We'll have to pick up the full year next year. You'll see that'll be offset by a loss in the contract with waste management on the next page. So a lot going on the personnel side of the equation for the 24 budget. Again, on the non-personnel side, there's that kind of, we're losing part of the waste management contract, which is very helpful. We rolled this number up, contracts and unavoidable expenses. These are things where I think our mowing contracts are going up significantly. A lot of the contracts that we have for police services or in other departments, Microsoft enterprise agreements, all have some kind of cost escalator in them. We've got some IS charges in there, as well as some other things that we absolutely have to purchase from a safety perspective, turnout gear for the fire department that's going out of date per OSHA standards, all that kind of stuff. So we've got somewhere near $3 million worth of, we kind of have to buy it and we don't have a choice type items. We're recommending additional funding for vehicle replacement to try and stay on a decent replacement schedule, as well as to catch up with the inflation costs of a lot of our equipment that we talked about already. And then a couple of other things in there. I'll note the compensation study that we talked about with Captain Allen. We're going to look citywide at a comp and class study, see where we are compared to the market and what we might need to do in order to get pay to a level where it should be market wise. That $200,000 is just to do the study. It would potentially be millions and millions of dollars to implement the study if it were to come back showing that we are significantly under budget. From a revenue side, again, sales tax, what we're showing right now is kind of 3% growth from where we're at through the end of the year and 3% growth next year. That could change if sales tax keeps sliding down. This is one of those, the forecast is going to change every month based on the information that we get, but that's currently what we're looking at. We were showing about a 1.75% growth in property taxes, in the property tax base. That's a pretty standard year, but that fluctuates a lot from year to year. I'll show you on the next slide. We've seen growth as low as 1.4% in 21, as high as 2.8% in the current year. So there is a lot of fluctuation in the different parts of that base, be it real property or business personal property listings. But our early forecast was just under 2% growth for next year. I'll slide back real quick and say there are a couple of things. We talked about construction permits. So we do see a little bit of a slowing in terms of permitting for new things. And this is one where I'm just kicking myself. Recycling commodities is a market that is just, we can't keep a line on where it's at. The fluctuation and variation from year to year has been 30, 40, 50%. So we're going to come in a little under budget this year, and we're just going to kind of track that for next year. A note here, just in terms of outside of our general fund. So for some of our enterprise operations, we are probably looking at a stormwater management fee increase. The stormwater management fee was created 15 years ago and has not been adjusted in 15 years. Basically, that means we're collecting about half the money that we used to in terms of inflation. There's a lot out there in stormwater in terms of projects that need to be funded. And we're short-staffed, so we're having to use some contracts to stand some of that up. And I will tell you, the private sector charges a pretty penny for engineering services. So we are potentially looking at an increase in the 24 budget, and then maybe subsequent increases in future years for stormwater fees. Had they been increased regularly over the course of the last 15 years, we'd probably have a much more normalized or lower rate, but we're kind of getting to that point where it's necessary to do something a little more drastic to keep that fund solvent for future years. Just some notes on public assemblies. So the convention center is actually doing really well this year. In light of everything else that's happening, the convention center has booked like it never has before. Prior to the pandemic, and prior to the renovation, we had subsidies approaching $1 million to the convention center annually. If they stay on the pace they're at right now, they're actually going to make money, which is something we have not seen in a very long time. So that is absolutely wonderful. On the flip side of that, we do have some increasing costs at the fairgrounds and Bowman Gray Stadium. They're running some operating deficits and they don't have large cash reserves. So a note to City Council that in the future, we've either got to shore up those kind of business operations or the tax rate might be on the hook to subsidize them. So we'll talk about parking later as we need to, but I just want to put it out there. There are some requests for capital in parking. What tends to happen in the parking fund is every time we build a deck and about the time it gets to where it makes money, we sell it off. And so the parking fund is always at a little bit of a struggle, and we have to have conversations about how much subsidy is required for our parking deck operations. Here's the list of these. We'll send you this entire presentation, but this is kind of the normal calendar that we would have for when we release the budget. So what we have is the early forecast happened last month. Our trial balance budget, where we'll tell council where we expect to be in the proposed budget, is next month. We'll actually give them the budget in late May, and then they've got about 3 weeks where they talk about anything they want to change. And budget adoption is slated for Tuesday, June the 20th. So that is the early budget forecast component of this. You can see a little 20 down in the corner. There are 74 pages in this presentation. And so I will not go through the rest of this other than to say, if you really want to see it, and I will just click through these, there is a lot on where we are with our strategic plan. And I've run out of memory. Good. I won't even flip through it.
You will send it to us, right, though?
Absolutely. The capital project piece is the one that I will stop at and say where a lot of the time was spent with City Council. We currently we showed them roughly 300 projects in our finance system that are currently budgeted for. About 30 of those are what we call holding codes, meaning think we've got a pot of money for economic development, but the specific project hasn't been identified. So you could say 260 to 270 active live projects at minus 20% staffing. So what we were trying to push to city council with the rest of this presentation, if you go through and look at it, is there is a lot in the hopper. We really don't need to focus on adding more to the hopper. We need to focus on getting done with the projects that you've already funded. The city council has made a lot of money available over the last 8 years. It's more than $400 million worth of general obligation debt and limited obligation bonds just for general government projects. There's a lot out there to get done. It would be great to let staff focus on finishing some of those or getting through some of the phases of those projects before adding more to the list to design. I will also note, as a result of that, one of the council members introduced last night, and it got through finance committee, a resolution where the council would limit itself on adding new projects for city staff to undertake until we can get some of the things in the queue, through the queue, and finished. So again, we'll send you that whole presentation, but there's a good chunk of that discussion that is about capacity and the inability of staff to manage additional projects and get things done in a timely fashion. So I will leave you any kind of overarching questions for where we are, kind of where we think we'll end 23 or where we might be in 24. Again, at a high level, sales tax may not be coming in as great as it has in prior years. The property tax base is not expanding like many of our peers in the Charlotte-Raleigh area. And we've got some pretty significant increases on the personnel side to keep up with inflation and retirement costs. That's kind of the 20-second distillation of what we're looking at in the 24 budget. Other issues, comments, concerns there? And I will unshare that. Otherwise, that's about all we have for you this morning.
Scott, I do have a question
Yes,
when
ma'am.
it comes to personnel.
Uh-huh.
So I know prior to COVID, we were sitting pretty good in personnel with personnel matters, I guess, with the number of people hired, blah, blah, blah. But it seems as post-pandemic, we've had a increase in most of personnel for various reasons. And I'm looking at numbers across our state where, baby boomers, it's time for a lot of them to retire. So how many in the city personnel are going to be in that retirement phase for the next 2-3 years, or in that phase where it's going to impact the budget, where we now have a larger or increase in staff shortage if we're not able to replace those persons in a timely fashion so those projects can be completed in a timely fashion? Are we planning ahead with those numbers or looking at those numbers to include in our 23-24 budget?
So in terms of additional vacancies, I mean, we budget for a position.
Okay.
And if it's currently got somebody in it, we budget their current salary plus the average merit. If it's vacant, we actually budget it at whatever the minimum for that position is in the pay plan. I know that Human Resources does look at who's eligible for retirement. And I haven't looked at those numbers specifically. I will tell you, just because somebody's eligible at 30 years doesn't mean they retire. We've got folks like our sanitation director, Stevie Doolin, who I think is in his 43rd or 44th year.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got some folks that don't make it to 30 either, and they decide 26 or 27 is enough, and they'll take a partial, and they're done with city service. I think it is both the retirements, but it's also a lot of attrition to other organizations in the private sector that's really hurting us. And again, we could have our human resources director come and talk to you a little bit about this. But from a budget perspective, the question for us really is, we have such a high vacancy rate. Are we over budgeting for the number of people we really presume are going to be actually employed? And I could get into kind of a philosophical discussion of what that means. When I showed you we're going to come in $4 million under budget in FY23 on personnel services, that's in addition to a $4 million plug that we already have for attrition. So realistically, we're going to come in $8 million under the authorized per department. We just had that $4 million. We knew organizationally there was going to be a lot of vacancy. So we budgeted an estimate of $4 million in salary savings, and it's really probably going to come in closer to 8. I think there are going to be some conversations around, if you can't fill the positions, is there a different expectation in the level of service that's being provided? And does the city's physical planning really need to account for the fact that we know, even if we wanted to, we're not going to fill 500 positions next year. It's just not going to happen. So the budget problem with that is, if you take it away, if at some point you want to add it back, it doesn't just go back because you want it to. You then have to find those resources to cover it. And I think sometimes people think, oh, just take it away for a year and then we'll bring it back next year. But if you take it away for a year, when you bring it back, there has to be some revenue source to cover it. It doesn't just hop back onto the books magically. Those are the management discussions that probably are taking place upstairs over the course of the next couple of months. Is there a new normal of some sorts where we go to the city council and say, there's a lower level of service and our budget is going to reflect that there is a lower level of service, and we cannot hire those people even if we wanted to, short a significantly large, difference in recruiting strategies, whether it be pay increases or other things. So on the personnel side, there are some probably interesting conversations at a management level about what it means to be operating at 20+% vacancy, both on the budget side, but also on the actual management of the services. How do you get it done? So I could sit here and talk for another hour about this. There are a lot of departments who are coming to me now saying, I've got a lot of salary savings and I can't get the work done. Can I issue a contract? Can I use some of that salary savings, go hire a vendor to do it instead? We're taking that on ad hoc on a case-by-case basis and looking at what can we do and how can we do it. But in some cases, we've done that. There are some sidewalk repair services where we have an entire crew that would have done sidewalk maintenance that's not available. So we're going to go find a vendor and issue a contract for $100,000 or $200,000 and really pay for that with salary savings. We would have done it in-house, but instead we're going to pay a vendor to do it. Questions long-term are, should we cut those positions if we can't fill them and just outsource that in perpetuity? A lot of those questions are starting to come up, and they'll be a part of potentially this budget, but also the 25 budget as well.
Okay.
Yeah. It's a very, very good question.
Is that like, and you said it could be interesting to have somebody from HR come and talk to us. Are they the ones kind of driving that conversation, or is it, like you said, kind of ad hoc from a department by department conversation? I mean, from my perspective, and maybe from ours, it'd be interesting to see where that future investment would be. Is it in kind of reallocating, like you said, or is there enough energy behind kind of shifting the calculus a little bit, having conversation about recruitment on a larger scale, recruitment and retention, I guess. I think that there's enough interest from this group, at least, to have a conversation about what that future looks like.
So I'll answer that kind of twofold. Yes, our centralized human resources department is thinking about that recruitment and retention component organizationally. I am getting the individual calls from the department heads saying, I got a group of really angry residents and a council member that is asking me why we haven't got this done. I can contract it out. Can you find the resources for me to do it? And we have those kind of one-on-one discussions about, yes, you've got enough salary savings above and beyond what we've already budgeted for. And so we'll do this or that. What we have to be very careful is that we're not increasing the level of service and then spending more than we had in salary savings. And when we do that, making sure everybody in the management team is aware of what we're doing. If I show city council, we're going to come in $3 or $4 million to the good because of salary savings, and then we turn around and make $2 million worth of decisions to contract something out, it just needs to be on everybody's radar that we've switched our service provision format, and therefore we're not going to add as much cash to the bank account, but we're also going to get more services provided to the residents that want them. So the communication lines around what we're doing are somewhat informal at this point, but it's very important that everybody's on the same page. And so I'm trying to be very careful in making sure that everybody on the management team and everybody in HR is aware of when we're making those kinds of trade-offs. So Tony, that leads into a really good segue, which is in terms of the work plan for this year. We were going to talk about affordable housing. We were going to talk about social services. We were going to talk about law enforcement collaboration. And then what's next in terms of those kind of shared services or things that cities and counties are looking at together. We didn't have a lot else to move forward with in terms of the agenda for next month. So we were going to bring back kind of responses to some of your questions, as well as a review and recap of some of the things that have been talked about. But we could add to this agenda as well to have someone from Human Resources come talk about budget development. And one of the things affecting budget at the highest levels right now is organizational attrition. Could really talk, and maybe have somebody from the management team too, if we wanted, come talk to you about, where we are on recruitment and retention, what we've actually done, where we expect to be, and kind of what that long-term vision is for how do we get people back in the seats, or if we can't, what are the conversations from a management level that happen about service provision? That's absolutely something that could be on next month's agenda.
That sounds like a great idea to me.
Okay.
Yeah, sure. I mean, it renders a lot of the other stuff moot, right? If there aren't people to take.
Answers a lot of, we'll probably answer a lot of our questions. Yeah.
Right. There's no other projects if there isn't personnel. So.
Sure. And the conversation is also very interesting on when we had it with council. There's operations and there's projects. And what's happening now is we're having to pick.
Right.
There are folks who we want a project to get done, but something happens and there's nobody in the field to do it. And you're having to take somebody off of project management and have them literally respond to something in the field as a manager or an on-site supervisor. It really is a struggle, and it is definitely something we're looking at, but I can have some folks from HR and the management team come speak a little more directly about where we are and what we might be thinking about doing in the future. Sure. Cool. Hey, Seta, are you talking? I think you're on mute if you're trying to say something.
Sorry, I'm sorry.
No worries.
I just have one more question in reference to the resolution that you spoke of earlier through City Council with, withholding from adding to the projects, instead just deal with the current projects, getting them through the pipeline and completed. Are we going to stick with that? Because that really would help with the shortage and taking some of the burden from the current staff, because again, I think one of the goals, if not, should be to retain the staff that we have, and overworking staff in any position is a reason for us to increase or decrease our retention numbers. And so I was just hoping that we're going to stick with that resolution. And how do we get around these biases where one may think that my project is more important than this project? How do we prioritize the projects themselves?
So can we stick to it? I will say the resolution is, if it passes the full city council next Monday, basically empowers management staff to say no to elected officials when they request something directly of us.
Okay.
They can still, as a group, decide to come back and do something. The resolution also authorizes the manager in emergency situations to do what's necessary to effect a project that's of emergency nature or some kind of critical equipment component for something out in the field. But it's really incumbent upon the elected officials to police themselves in this matter, not come back to subsequent meetings in the future and continue to add projects to the hopper. What it does also require is, in the case that an elected official wants to bring something, there would be a professional analysis of what does that mean? What are we trading off? What's coming off the list, or what is going to get significantly delayed, so that we would at least put in front of the city council, you want to do X, therefore Y is going to be slowed down or put on the back burner for a while. So they may still add things, but there will at least be some kind of public disclosure of what that means for other project schedules.
Okay.
Yeah. But we will go ahead, Fred.
Oh, I was going, so I guess since we're wrapping up, I have a completely unrelated question. Somebody I know asked me if these meetings are open to the public.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so if someone wants to sit in on this meeting, what do they do?
Email me and we'll give them the link next month.
Okay, cool.
So, yep. All of these types of boards and commission meetings are open to the public. Generally, what we try and do, the process is we don't publish the link because we don't want to get Zoom bombed. So if you wanted to, once we sent the agenda to you on Monday, if you wanted to share it with someone, it has the link in it. You could feel free to do that.
I
well.
can share it if I want to.
Yeah. For this, CBAC tends to be a little more informal, anyway, kind of in nature. So we would tell you if you have someone who's interested. Also, there are a couple of vacant seats on CBAC. So if someone is really interested, they should contact the mayor's office and say they want to be on CBAC and not just watch. So
I'll mention that.
always a plug there to get a couple extra seats filled if we can. Never waste a good opportunity. But yeah, all of the city's meetings like this. I mean, if you want to watch, this is actually being streamed in real time on YouTube and TV 13. You can see.
Oh, I knew it was being recorded. I didn't know we were being streamed. Oh, nice.
I think so. I'll check.
I'm on YouTube somewhere. Cool. Hey.
It is definitely out there for them to watch. I think they're live streamed. I think if we have more than one event at the same time, they have to pick which one. But I will check with marketing and make sure that's still the case. I know it was during COVID, but while we're doing everything via Zoom, I'll check with them and make sure on that, Fred.
I can't imagine we wouldn't get top billing.
Yeah, no, we are being live streamed right now. I just found it.
There you go.
2 people are watching apparently. Yeah. Okay.
Very good. If I've not made that available to you, yes, that does happen. There you go. All right. Well, we'll kind of take what we've got in terms of questions, not just from this meeting, but from the others, do a little more research, come back to you with some follow-up, and then add that kind of human resources management component with personnel. It's really personnel management, and we'll talk about the budget implications of it. But try to come back next month and talk about that as one of the major drivers of the 24 budget process. That sounds great. Yeah, our marketing folks just said you are live now. So there we go.
Yeah, I found it on YouTube. Yep.
Cool. Well, unless anybody's got anything else, I will say we are actually, I think if Tanya sent out the minutes from last week, we would need to approve the minutes on the agenda.
Beat me to it.
There we go. So if everybody's had a chance to look at the minutes, could we get a motion to approve?
Motion to approve.
And a second. There we go. Everybody in favor, say aye and raise your right hand.
Aye.
My left hand.
Ayes have it. We'll call those minutes approved from the prior meeting. Alrighty, the next meeting, April 19th, already scheduled, 9 a.m. We will send out some reminders. If anybody has any issues with that date and time, let us know. Otherwise, we will see you again in just over a month.
Thank you.
Thank
Thanks, everyone.
you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Have a great one.